Hello, folks, and thanks for listening to the Defiance Ventures podcast. Today should be a lot of fun. I'm talking to my good buddy, Derek Holt. We met in 2008 while both attending Duke's Fuqua School of Business. Derek was whip smart back then, finishing with a perfect 4.0, and he was the only one who did that in a group comprising some of the most alpha and awesome people I've ever met. So I'm excited to check in on one of my best friends from grad school, but also he has worked with some amazing people since Fuqua. He had a stop or two along the way to where he is now that we'll hopefully touch on throughout the interview. And most importantly, his current company is one of the anti-fragile ones that is thriving because it is helping customers to get through the COVID crisis. I've had a couple of founders of these businesses on, and each one has been very interesting, and the feedback's been great. So Derek, thank you so much for joining.
Awesome to be here. I like how you qualified it that I used to be whip smart, which I would agree with. I used to be whip smart, but no, it's awesome to be here. A bit of a reunion as sorts. And also you could have left out the 2008 thing, but I guess it is what it is at this point, right?
Got to date ourselves.
Exactly right.
And it was certainly an interesting time to be in grad school. We had a financial crisis going on, which was unprecedented. And if we thought that was unprecedented, boy, 2020.
That's for sure. And I tell you, I always do think back about it when people ask about grad school, especially you and I. We are in startups, and so there's often a weirdness. Oh, you went to business school, right? And I've always found that it served me well. I think you would say the same thing, but I do always comment. We were in some ways lucky to be in school at that time because of. You go to a finance class and they're teaching you how to price future earnings, and it's like, really, like that's not how the world's working right now, right? So it is that was a challenging time. I can only imagine though, to be in school right now at a distance and all the other complexities, and so
absolutely,
it's an unfortunate but a reality, yeah.
So before we get started, Derek, the NCAAs were canceled during a season in which Duke spent some time at number one. How do you think March Madness would have ended for Duke had it played out?
I have as you do, I have a son who I've brainwashed effectively, and he was as emotional about the fact that the Duke team wasn't going to play together as he was about not being able to go back to school and everything else. So I'm doing my job. I like this team. We've more recently, we've had good years where we had a lot of really good players, but no like crazy first, second pick folks. I'd like to say we would have gone deep. I don't know if they had the full in them, but it takes a lot to get through those last couple of rounds. So unfortunate and it feels like a year and a half ago that happened. Yeah. But unfortunate that they didn't get a chance to play it out for sure.
It is. I think when Trey Jones was healthy and playing and you had Vernon Carey, and I mean, I felt like this team had the potential to be quite a bit better than last year's team. Last year's team had obvious superstar potential. Yeah. But this one, I feel like we've always been better when we gel and have a team rather than.
That's right. I think even in the Kyrie. I'm biased. I'm under 6 foot, so I always align to the point guards. And I would also argue when we've had good point guards, all the way back to Bobby Hurley, you've had really good years. So yeah, I'm with you. And it's sad that I hope the Joneses keep having more kids because it's sad that we got nothing left there. But maybe there's a cousin or a relative we can get in.
We ran out of Plumleys, so we started going with the Joneses.
Exactly right.
As I knock my microphone over here.
This is what happened when you talk about Duke. We get all
animated.
Exactly.
Get totally animated. So what about your alma mater of Penn State, or how's their football team looking for next year?
I was actually, in some ways it feels like super surface level to be disappointed given the pain and the challenges folks are facing. But we were gearing up for a pretty spectacular year. And as I like to remind people, we still have the second largest collegiate stadium in the country. And sadly, we were planning on going up to Ohio State game, 110,000 people in a whiteout. It's going to be hard for me to believe that that's going to happen this year, and it may be different for a while, right? And so hopefully they still get to play, like everybody. A lot of people put their heart and soul in a lot of projects, and this has kind of turned a lot of things upside down. And so you hope for everybody, whether it's an artist or a performer, there's a lot of bands and others.
Stand-up comics, for instance. Exactly. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out. Well, let's jump right in.
Sure.
Can you first just tell the folks what K4Connect is and what you guys do?
Yeah, so we're a mission-centered company focused on building technology solutions for older adults, and then we have a sort of a separate line of business for individuals of any age living with some form of disability. So the whole idea is this whole wave of smart home, connected wellness, social, on-demand services. Most of that technology has been targeted to the next generation. And our thesis was, okay, but it has more implication. It goes kind of from novelty to utility if you think about the folks that could use it the most, but unfortunately have been sort of left behind this technology revolution in some cases. There's always exceptions. I'm reminded any senior living community I go into, you find somebody who like invented the microprocessor. So there's definitely exceptions. They laid the foundation for all the work that we get to do. But that's the thesis. And as you mentioned in your intro, the time has never been more important. And frankly, the digital divide has been never more obvious when we've had to go quickly into isolation. It's really impacted older adults dramatically. And obviously they're more susceptible when it comes to COVID. You've also seen challenges with folks that are financially less well off when it comes to distance learning and connectivity. And so we feel lucky to be in an opportunity to at least help where we can, even though obviously it's a horrible set of circumstances.
Sure. It's really interesting. I've said for the past 6, maybe 8 weeks that what we're seeing with COVID is an acceleration in adoption and demand for things that were already gaining steam. Delivery services, e-commerce, video conferencing for work, distance learning, secure public cloud deployments much more broadly. We acquired a business that needed modernization in a bad way. And one of the things we told them was, you have to be able to work remotely. We don't know if we want your office space. And they said, our job can't be done remotely. And so for us, COVID, there was a silver lining in there that it accelerated. And sure enough, they were able to work completely remotely, but sometimes it takes a crisis to move things that are already underway. In your space, I think telemedicine is probably an example.
Huge. Yeah.
Can you comment on this just general concept of it accelerating things that were already a trend?
Look, I'm not an economist. Maybe I'd like to play one on a podcast if I could, but the again, if you take the real human part, which obviously is really, really challenging, and you've got huge impacts on people's lives and whatnot. One of the things we've seen, and we've had this discussion, is this a disrupting event or is it an accelerating event? And maybe it's both, but the accelerating piece is the one that is starting to play out really aggressively. And we see this in senior. That a really good example is, so when everything happened, now, senior living in particular is as ready for flu outbreaks as any, hospitals and senior living are as ready for it as anybody when it comes to traditional flu, right? This was obviously a bit different, but they had protocols in place, unlike most universities didn't necessarily have a really good plan, or schools were scrambling, right? But what we saw was they went into quarantine, and obviously this is unprecedented within senior living, but they've had to start to provide on-demand groceries. So you had to provide delivery groceries, which you and I have been probably doing forever. And once you do it, you're like, hey, this isn't a bad experience, right? They've had to provide dining in room and kind of on-demand dining. And as is often the case, you're forced to do it, and they just really threw people at it, right? It became a people problem, which doesn't sustain and doesn't scale, but it solves the near term. And so now what we're seeing is, in just that one vertical of culinary, right? We're seeing the communities now adopting technology, and interestingly enough, the residents, the older adults, saying, yeah, we may go back to the cafe, yeah, but we may go back to the grocery store, but like, this is pretty good, and we don't want to stop, even if the COVID realities start to wane a little bit. And so I think you're going to see that across a bunch. And I'm with you. This was going to be, for us, I thought it'd be a 5 to 10 year sort of transformation of senior living when it comes to digital. I think it'll now happen the next, call it 12 to 24 months. And the communities that are able to play offense and get there, I think are going to survive and thrive. The ones that don't, the ones that are still debating whether or not they should get campus-wide Wi-Fi, I think are going to have a hard time.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I've observed is that when an industry digitizes, there's much more of a winner-take-all dynamic than with more traditional bricks and mortar businesses. So, for instance, there can only be one Facebook aggregating supply and demand instead of literally tens of thousands of newspapers and magazines, or there's 1 or 2 Ubers and Lyfts rather than thousands of cab companies. Is K4Connect hoping to take advantage of this dynamic, or do you think it might be different in your case?
Interesting. It's a really interesting question, how these things structure out as you go through this transformation. I expect there to be consolidation in senior living, although I am not, and I know this sounds counterintuitive, it doesn't feel to me that senior living has such economies of scale that the loss of some of the boutique brand local kind of flavor will win out. It's almost like what we saw happening in the hotel industry where, it used to be in the 80s and 90s, Hilton, the Marriott, and consistency was the key. And then you've seen this whole notion of kind of the boutique, AC Marriott, these kind of edgy ones that provide it. And when you're thinking about where you're going to move, if you think about senior living, this is a place you're going to move to for, in some cases, 10, 15, 20 years. There is still value in, I believe, in the uniqueness of the service and the design and the architecture, et cetera. But when it comes to the service providers that are going to provide to this industry, I totally believe that it's going to consolidate really quickly. You'll probably see some acquisitions. You'll probably see you'll see some companies that may have had some cash flow challenges that just go away, which again, and this is not that you're ever happy to see a company go away, but it also is a good example of what an accelerant, right? Like, yep. And no offense to the JCPenney folks, but like when I found that JCPenney was still not yet out of business, it actually surprised me when they declared bankruptcy. I thought that like played out 5 or 10 years ago. And so that was going to happen, COVID or no COVID. That company was not going to recover. They were saddled with debt. It was not going to happen. So it accelerated that. So I think that's right. I think we'll see some consolidation. I also think you're going to see, and we are fully aware of this, I think you're going to see a lot of big tech coming in. We just made an announcement last week with our partners at Amazon, and they're paying real attention to this demographic. It's big, underserved. It's the fastest growing age demographic in the history of mankind as you look at the boomers becoming of age. And so I think you're going to have a lot of new entrants. You're going to have a lot of new players. You'll have some restructuring, but I'd say it's a pretty dynamic time.
That's interesting that you mentioned Amazon, because I introduced you to a friend of mine, Scott Lean, who is solving a similar problem, but from a very different angle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
more consumer focused. But he was able to quickly partner with Lyft, but especially with the cellular providers, because they see that this is a big demographic and a growing demographic, but they've not been able to drive any real usage of data, and they see his platform as being that a way to connect with seniors.
That's right. And I know that, and I love the work that those guys have done. There's a bunch of, we don't want to go into all the details of it, but it's a totally 55 million people in the United States, almost doubling in the next 10, 15 years. You've got some countries that 35-40% of their population is going to be over the age of 65 as people have less and less children. But there are some unique challenges. Distribution's really hard. You're not just going to buy a bunch of Google AdWords and hope for the best, right? The expectation on kind of DIY, whereas you and I might just play around with something. If it doesn't work, if my kid has something that doesn't work, I kind of get a kick out of it. I want to go fix it, right? In many cases you've seen in other technologies going into the senior space, if it doesn't work, they either blame themselves, like they did something wrong, or it just goes into a drawer and it's like, I'm done with that. So I think there's opportunities, but at the same time, you got to figure out a way to approach it. And I think a lot of the big brands are looking at folks like ourselves and others and saying, hey, they understand this demographic. They understand the use cases. They understand how to support it. But for sure, they can help us kind of get into a new area and deliver value in a new way.
That's great. So speaking of change, you used to travel as much as anybody I know. How many countries have you been to, Derek?
A lot. 27, 28 probably would be my guess. And they let me back into most of them. Not all. No, but no, I had a super cool opportunity. In fact, a lot when we were in school, I did for work to travel to a lot of places. At the same time, it is important to note the iPad didn't come out until like right at the end of, if you remember, right at the end of our school. So I was lugging around those crazy
ThinkPads
all over the world. You get a lot of work done flying to Beijing, but it's heavy to carry those things around, right?
I forgot about the textbooks and the 100-page case studies that we had to read.
Yeah, I just lugged them around. I didn't know what else to do at that point.
So obviously you traveled a lot. That clearly has changed. I think personally, Zoom is now competing with the entire airline industry, and I know who my money is on. Can you comment on how much you think you and others will shift away from travel versus remote as a result of this?
I've thought about this a ton, like probably you and I similarly. Like I've had more dinners with my family in the last 90 days than I probably have in the last X number of years. And that's obviously not a good thing, but it is a reality when you're in the kind of the business world that we're in. And, I think it goes back to your accelerant, right? Like this was happening, it was chipping away, but it was chipping away slowly. And I think even myself, if it was a big meeting, if it was a big deal, if it was a big investor, you would default to flying and going in person in fear that you wouldn't get the outcome that you wanted. And then you'd be like, oh, if I would have just got on the plane, right? It was just sort of built into us from the history. And I think now that we've been forced, people are closing deals digitally. People are, buying houses digitally. Like there's just a
Yep.
lot happening there. And sure, some of it will come back, and I'm sure I'll be on a plane for certain things when the time's right. But yeah, I agree with you. The whole thing's been reorganized, and this is a more efficient, probably a safer, better for the environment. Like there's a whole bunch of pros outside of obviously the airlines are going to be their model is going to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's safe to say, and on the same theme as before, like it was already probably
It was happening.
changing.
It would take it 20, 30 years, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah. So let's go through the history of K4Connect. When did you guys start it?
Yeah, so I'm not a founder of the company. A guy named Scott Moody and another guy, Jonathan Gould, started the company. Would have been probably late 2013, early 2014, probably. I joined a year later, really the first year. So Scott had been an entrepreneur before, founded a company called Authentic in 1999. They went public in 2007. A great time to go to business school and to go public, apparently. No, a lot of war stories there to just kind of keep your head above water. But they survived, they thrived. Similarly, then he was in the biometric space, so I think fingerprint sensors and whatnot. And if you go back and look at it, there's a bunch of companies that just didn't make it through that downtime. They emerged, they took huge market share. And then in 2012, they were acquired by Apple. To this day, the only publicly traded company Apple's ever acquired, and they became the fingerprint sensor on, I think, the iPhone 5S, the Touch ID, and still a huge number of their employees are employed there as they've gone into facial recognition and whatever else is obviously probably coming. So Scott had taken time off, after a ride like that, and then just sort of was re-energized. I think from a life perspective, said I have a lot more to give. I have a lot more to give back, and started K4, frankly, under the notion of if we're successful with this, he could use the money to impact the world positively, right? And it was maybe a year in or a year and a half in, just right when I joined, that we met a gentleman who kind of opened our eyes to how this technology could be used in ways to help people's lives, kind of be improved or help them drive more independence. And it was really cool. It was the only opportunity I've had as a business person where my philanthropic efforts were always over here and my business efforts are always here. In this case, we can kind of that classic do well while you do good, right? And for us, it's not like a bolt-on marketing thing. Like if you buy buy a hat from us, we'll give a hat to somebody who needs it. Those things are fine, but ours are it's core to our business. The more we're able to deploy, the more impact that we can have, which is great for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, you're improving lives. I talked about Scott and GrandPad, and that really is a big thing to him. It's important to him to connect the greatest generation, and too often they're forgotten about. And when you can make money doing that, and you can show with these products that you're improving people's lives and extending lives and their happiness and everything else, that's got to be really
it's super cool too. I mean, everyone reads their reviews and all these other things, but we do get some really powerful inbound, both from end users, but the ones that really hit me hard are from family members that the loved one has passed away. So it kind of in many ways a former user of our technology that had passed away, unfortunately. And to hear like how it just kind of gave them that spark, that purpose, that intrigue, and kind of became a new thing for them to learn and to master. It goes a long way in terms of impacting and feeling good about what you're doing. Right.
Yep. So what year was that again? You said
that. So think like 2013, I joined in 2015. Okay. We had not raised any outside capital, and subsequently we raised a seed round, and I guess in 2015 an A round. I'm going to get my years all screwed up here, but think like 2016, and then a B round in late 2018.
Okay. Yeah. That's great. And obviously for a guy like Scott, it's not as hard to raise money. Certainly, I would guess this time around.
Yeah, it's funny. It's not hard to get a meeting, right? But as you know, you've been down this road a few times. Like, if you have a network, you have a track record, you have a total advantage, right? I've always thought this. There's a lot of great entrepreneurs that either live someplace that's like not a traditional entrepreneurial ecosystem, and or don't have relationships to get meetings. And it is hard to get kind of through the front door because there's so much volume, and it is a very networked kind of industry. But we got a lot of no's. I mean, anytime I've done this, maybe my third time doing it, like if you're not ready for a truckload of no's to find that one yes in the haystack, like this
Yeah.
is not the world for you. So we got a lot of meetings, we got a lot of no's, but we've been super lucky with the investors that we have. And some kind, this is like getting married in some regards, right? Like we were dating them just like they were dating us. And so, these are long, especially these days, these are 7, 8, 9-year type, kind of partnerships. So we've been lucky to have folks that are believe in what we're trying to do. Obviously they're investing money and there's the financial side of it, but they've been, true partners in this whole thing.
That's funny. Your answer is very similar. I had Igor Jablikov, our mutual friend, on the podcast about 7 or 8 months ago. And he said the same, obviously a guy who invented Alexa.
We both are in Raleigh. We've talked about it a lot. He's much more accomplished and smarter than I am, but it made me feel good that he got as many no's as I got.
Yeah.
Right. So,
well, that's the thing. When you sell a business for hundreds of millions of dollars to Amazon, like you would think, but he said the exact same thing. Like, yeah, it got me the meetings, but you still have to sell.
Some of it too, in the defense of the VCs, right? They define a thesis, right? And they try to do their best to stay to that, whether it's stage or industry, areas that they think they have expertise. And so I might come in with this genius idea, but they want to invest in ed tech Series C, right? And so I feel bad that they said no, but in some ways, look, if it was an easy yes, you probably don't have a great differentiated idea, right? In some ways, you're presenting a future that most don't believe it is going to exist. That's by definition why most people don't see those seams in the market, right?
Yep. So during those, the 4, 5, 6 intervening years, you mentioned a couple capital raises. What were some of the key milestones along the way for you? Like, for instance, how long did it take to get client number 1?
Yeah, we did. So right when I joined, we signed our first 2 pilots, right? And at that time, I would say roughly 20-30% of senior living communities in terms of population even had a smartphone or a tablet. Fast forward to today, 85% of seniors moving into senior living have a device, right? So, I mean, it's been a transition that's happening kind of in real time for us. But, it was about building that out. It was about product market fit. It's not that different than all of the normal startup stuff. The one part that is pretty dynamic about the work that we're doing is it's an enterprise sale. So we sell to senior living communities, but our end user is a combination of staff members in the enterprise and the community and residents. So we've got a little bit of like a B2B to C kind of dynamic
what about
paying for it, but you got to make them happy.
Yeah, got it. And what about, is there a further dynamic? Because for GrandPad, they had the realization, sell to the 55 or 60-year-old kids because they're going to get the benefit of communication. Do you view those children or grandchildren as users?
Huge influencers, right? Yeah. Huge influencers. We cater a lot of our content marketing. We cater a lot of it to them because in the end, they, as the GrandPad folks have rightfully said, they hold a lot of influence, right? Often, and it's probably important to note, this isn't a perfect analogy, but we often think, in fact, you read the news today, all you hear about is skilled nursing, right? That is a very important, but a very small part of this broader continuum. If you think about senior living, it goes all the way back now to basically 55 plus communities that are being made by Del Webb and Villages and, the age restricted Traditions of America, all the way through independent living where you still have a car. You might even have an independent home and you're very on the go, but you're starting to take your retirement into your own hands. And then it goes into assisted and memory care and skilled and that whole spectrum. And so one of the things we had to remind ourselves very early is, much like I often say, like, seniors not liking technology is really just not accurate. It's that they don't like technology designed for somebody who's 20 or 30, right? Yeah. Like, which is what technology we get exposed to is. Silicon Valley is 20 and 30 and 40-year-olds for the most part, building stuff for 20 and 30 and 40-year-olds, right? And in that regard, we end up, in many ways, you end up seeing even ourselves, you could slip into this view of like, we got some users that are 65, we got some users that are over 100, right? So you're designing for a 4-decade span. And so it's naive to think that you could have a one size fits all, just like it's naive to think what you give a 10-year-old is what a 40 or 50-year-old would want. Right. And so we've had to really remind ourselves of that. And you're right. It's really a 3-legged stool. It's the staff members, it's the family members, and then most importantly, it's the older adult.
So you get the two pilots around the time that you join in
Two pilots,
2015.
and
Yeah.
then you had to go measure them, make them successful. And then a big part of my efforts, we had a great engineering team. Big part of my efforts with a bunch of folks on the team was just figure out how we're going to sell this. And we took a relatively unique for this industry. I spent a chunk of time at IBM, and one of the things IBM's bad at some things, but really good at sales and distribution, right? We could go acquire a regional company and get it out to 120,000 sellers and get meetings with Fortune 500 and drive big returns on that. And so we used a lot of, or at least I borrowed a lot of the things that I've seen work there, and didn't do the things that I didn't see work there. We built out a pretty solid enterprise sales. The next big thing was we kind of targeted in the, not the small, not the big, but kind of in the middle. We started to build out ROI and making it more of less of an aspirational kind of early adopter sale and more of a business transaction. And then we really started into this transformation approach over the last, say, 18 months, this idea of what we describe as evolving to become a smart community. And you've seen this with smart cities and other things, but what is the long-term vision? This isn't about buying a widget. This is about a journey. In some ways, the journey is as important as the destination when it comes to technology, because the destination keeps changing. And so we got pretty good at that. As like any other startup, we saw our challenges in that regard. And you then switch gears to, can you scale up support and education and customer success, right? There's always something. And then honestly, the COVID stuff, while you touched on earlier, it has accelerated people's interest. In some ways, it's forced folks to get into technology because of the realities of managing it. It's also forced us to change. Like, nobody wants to talk about transformation when they're in the deep end of the pool trying to keep their head above water, right? And so we've had to rethink, not necessarily, we've reprioritized some product roadmap stuff that changed, but we've also had to think about, like, how do you message this? And we've really focused in on how do we help people navigate their current reality, but we also think there's going to be a little bit of a window here where folks can be prepared for the next potential wave, between now and maybe September, October. So we're working with a lot of communities to make sure, hey, let's not get caught flat-footed again. Let's make sure we have the technology in place.
That's great. How did your client discussions evolve as the product evolved and matured? Were you selling bigger deals, or was it different solutions?
We've always been, and again, some of this is sort of how we approach it. It's also some of my bias of, like, if you're going to go, spend all this time getting a deal, you might as well go get a really big deal instead of a small deal, right? Sort of like companies, you might as well swing for the fences. If you get a double, you get a double, but if you bunt, you're unlikely to get a home run, right? And so we have seen the kind of portfolio. We kind of have a suite of capabilities and the ability to sell that. We also then are constantly balancing that with the ability to kind of land and expand. We'll talk about, right? How do you get a beachhead that brings real quick, real value to customers, become a trusted advisor, and then kind of diversify from there, right?
Well, again, your training at IBM set you up for that perfectly.
That was it. And I don't know why we always use a military analogy there, but like literally land on the beach. And you can either go wide on the beach or you go deep in the beach. But what I like about it is it puts the onus on us to make the customer successful. All of this is rooted in, being a great partner and success begets success. There's nothing new in this industry versus others. And frankly, in some cases, I'd say this industry's been burned a few times around things that kind of overpromise, underdelivered. And so we try our best to strike the right balance there and drive as much value. And if you land and expand, you better have your game ready, right? Because you got to really deliver on that first one. Otherwise, it's land and you're stuck, right? And so we try to balance it. But, again, like any other company, as the market evolves, as the competition evolves, we have to evolve. And so we're constantly tweaking that and testing it and measuring it.
So I'd like to play back March or February, March, April, and talk about your conversations, how they started to change with customers and with you and Scott and the other C-suite members and the board as the COVID crisis kind of unfolded. I think it caught a lot of people flat-footed and then built very quickly. I'm always curious how those discussions go down.
So first of all, when you say March, it feels like March 2010 in terms of how long these days have been. But so we the first thing that we did, and I think there's a little bit of an advantage, Scott in particular had a bit of more of a sense than even I would say I did around, this is going to be a big deal. And I don't know where that came from. Something, experience helps, right? And he's got a few more laps than I do. So we were very quickly, we kind of started an internal program. We called it COVID 911 that impacted a lot of internal functions, and we were trying to get ready. I don't think any of us knew, exactly, obviously, what it was going to be, but we were really way ahead of it. One of the things that we did very early, just on the business side, right? We're a startup like anybody. Cash is king. We were lucky to be in a pretty good position, but we quickly said, okay, let's look at budgets, right? We had just, interesting enough, we do an annual operating plan. It just came through December, and as often is the case, it spills into like the first week of January. And I felt like I just got done with budget season, and, fast forward 45 days later, it's like, yeah, throw all of that out and rethink about impact. And so we did what a lot of companies did. Like, there were projects we were working on that we still think are super interesting that we just had to say, like, hey, we're going to back off of that, put it on the shelf for a little while. We looked at what parts of the product suite we thought were going to be most impactful and thus from a financial perspective, the most likelihood to be successful. We did like what a lot of folks did. We kind of froze hiring a little bit. We kind of reshuffled some things. We've been very, very lucky, and it was a goal of ours going in to have very minimal, almost, at this, knock on wood, you never know what's going to happen, but we haven't had that make some of the real tough decisions that are often the case in these types of things. And so we really just went down to zero. We actually, and again, Scott drove this, we assumed no incremental revenue for a SaaS business. So we have the reoccurring, but no incremental revenue for longer than we thought probably was realistic. But like, let's look at the worst case scenario. And then we built things back up from then, made sure the cash lasted. So we did that exercise that, and those were hard, long discussions, right? There were days where you thought you might have to make a different decision here and there. And I'd like to tell you I had a full head of hair before that started. I didn't. But if I did, I think I would have probably lost some of it. And then we then went in, and one of the things that we've been very, very lucky with on the customer side is we sell mostly to the C-level, right? This is a broader transformational type thing. And I'd like to think we've built like not just business relationship, but like friendships as much. And I mean that, but as much as you do in some cases. And we just made a lot of phone calls, right? And we helped we let our customers help us identify where the pain points were. And then we did everything we could to solve them, either with technology we had already and kind of repurpose it, or even kind of bring in new partnerships. We did a great partnership, which we'll announce here in a couple of weeks, around a kind of crisis communication package that gave the communities hotlines that family members could call and get recorded, personalized, kind of up-to-date messages. And you just did a bunch of stuff. And honestly, a lot of the acceleration component of this, you could go do customer discovery for days and days and weeks, but when a crisis happens, all that stuff just bubbles up, right? You just got to be aware of it, and you got to be a little bit humble enough to admit that what your current or your previous view in the world might be a little bit different than it actually is now, right? And so it's been a whirlwind, and honestly, I feel like we're in a good position. We're starting to get more predictability back. Things are starting to open up a little bit, but I'm still uneasy, I guess would be the way to describe it. In some ways, that's the nature of being an entrepreneur, right? Like, yeah, if you're not, what was the only the paranoid survive, right? The book. This is paranoid on steroids, right?
Yeah, that's great. So switching gears a little bit, I've heard you talk when we've spoken before about how senior living and higher education have some commonalities between the two. And I wouldn't have really grouped those two together, but can you maybe speak to?
I would not either. I'm a big analogy person. And so, especially in businesses, I think sometimes certain businesses seem very, very different, but then you look at it and you're like, wait, they on the surface are different, but the economics and some of the models are the same. So the real analogy here is less higher education, more student housing as a component of higher education. The thing about senior living that you had to realize is, in many ways, and you'll see the parallel here, it's probably 8 businesses in one, right? It's a transportation company. It's a multifamily real estate company. It's a wellness company. It's like an activities company. They plan activities and entertainment, and they run anywhere from 1 to 10 restaurants. So if you go to a senior living community, some of the larger ones, you'll see a US Foods or a Cisco truck out back every morning, just like you would at your favorite, or you used to see at your favorite restaurant if you were out that early. So they are this amalgamation of a bunch of these businesses that then are presented to the market in that way, or in a new way. And by the way, when you think about things like on-demand transportation, They are in transportation because they had to be when they started this business model 20, 30, 40 years ago. Do they want to be in transportation? And is there not a room for a technology play with some of the on-demand stuff? The answer is yes, right? That's going to evolve, and I think this will accelerate it. But student housing, not that much different, right? At least when I was in school, right? You had a meal plan. If you wanted to go if you got sick, you went to the infirmary. I don't even know why it was called that, but it's like a weird, military word for it almost.
Well, I'm thinking back. I'm thinking back to the Fuqua days. They would transport us to Franklin Street because they hadn't turned Durham around yet.
Exactly, right. So yeah, it's very similar. It's also, from a financial perspective, for the most part, an all-inclusive model. So in senior living, things like utility and cable, that tends not to be carved out as a separate fee, and student has. So we're always looking at that. And in fact, there's actually a developer down your way that is literally develops two big businesses. They have a student housing business and they have a senior living business, which again, you wouldn't think tie together, but obviously it does, right?
Yeah, that's really cool. That when you explained that to me before, that helped me understand the business model of senior living for sure. So call it 5 years in, you've moved past strong venture growth to true, what sounds like exponential or explosive growth curve. Where do you see K4 going from here next? Where does it go?
Yeah, look, and we've talked about this publicly. There's 25,000 senior living communities in the United States, right? And you've got this massive swell demographic coming in. The baby boomers are really just getting to this age. For the most part, baby boomers are in their late 50s or 60s, right? And senior living these days, you tend to move in late 70s, and if you're not moving in until you have some kind of major challenges, it could be as late as in your 80s and your 90s. So we still have a long way to go there. We've talked about publicly, we're working with about 800. I'm not great at math, so let's call it 1,000. So 1,000 out of 25,000, you got a lot. And by the way, that's domestic. There's huge opportunities to provide more services within that base, and then obviously to get to more communities. At the same time, in the U.S., 95, 96% of people age in place, right? And I hate that terminology because you and I are sitting here literally aging in place as we go. But we think there's some opportunities in the home. And when you think about the latest, kind of the last big innovation in the home, were ramps and pool bars and PERS devices, the kind of I fall and I can't get up. There just hasn't been that much innovation. And the ability to start to bring some of this technology in. I also think you're going to see senior living communities. You're already seeing this a little bit. I think it's going to accelerate. And again, use the higher education model here. If you go back in the early 2000s, probably late 90s, early 2000s, when we were undergrad-ish, there was a lot. Internet was coming, high-speed internet was happening, and you saw people coming to big universities and say, hey, you should start thinking about online, right? That'd be a good thing. And all the big universities said, whoa, we're not doing that. Like, our business model is people come to our campus, and we got this whole town here and all these dorms and all these teachers on tenure and all this other stuff. And then you saw the emergence out of it because they punted on it. You saw these for-profit, the University of Phoenix's and other strayers kind of start to emerge. And they said, well, we got nothing to lose, right? Like, we'll just go digital. We'll be all digital.
Well, it's funny. Duke went digital before anybody else because they
were one of the very, very first ones. That's right.
They
had
to.
Look at it now.
Yeah.
23, I believe, of the top 25 online institutions are the names, the household names, right? And so senior living, I think, is historically said, okay, if you move to our campus, then you're somebody we'll serve. But in order to drive more revenue, they got to either raise rent or they got to build more apartments. What I think they're going to start to say is, hey, we got a lot of mixed use space. We got cafeterias, we got restaurants, we got gyms, and they're not full. And again, this will be post-COVID, but what if we had a membership type model where you could move here, but you also could do distance ed equivalent, right? And it solves a lot of the social isolation. With on-demand transportation, you can get to and from. I think you're going to just see some evolving of the business model. It's not going to be binary. You're only at home or you're only in a community. I think there's a middle area there.
That's really cool. I didn't even think about that kind of hybrid model. That's awesome. So, well, congratulations on all the success at K4. I would like to shift gears to your time at your employer. When I first met you, you mentioned working for IBM, and you talked a little bit about how that prepared you for what you're doing now. Can you maybe talk about what specifically you were doing at IBM and and how it prepared you for the last decade. And I want to get into in a little bit the rest of the last decade, because we've only been talking about K4.
So,
but
so just super top level summary. So I'm a computer engineer undergrad. So I was an engineer, right? And was writing code, was lucky enough to then move into consulting to consult around a product that I helped build. And it gives you a little bit of an unfair advantage there. Helped me kind of emerge in the largeness that is IBM, sometimes hard to kind of stand out, if you will. And then subsequently got moved into a bunch of different business roles and learned, partner channel management. And I was managing sales teams and had never been a seller. And those sorts of things. And that's where I think the Fuqua stuff really helped me get, while I had an education around being an engineer and therefore was pretty good at it, I was in business meetings that I was unsure that I was qualified to be in. Right. And so Fuqua helped kind of bridge that gap a little bit. But the big thing for me is, and I still hold to this, like I get the kind of religious, I'm a big company person, or I'm a startup person, or I started a company, I could never go back to a big company. And in some cases I get that, but I also look at all of these stages as just different problems and different opportunities. And we were doing $100+ billion transactional on an annualized basis. We had 120,000, sales rep. I mean, it's crazy, right? And as much as it was slow and it was hard to respond and all that sort of, all of those things are true of big companies, but you got to respect the scale and the reach, and you can get a meeting with anybody. And so there's a whole bunch of parts of that I learned from, and no matter what startup says, the goal is to be that, right? Like the goal is to scale to that point. And so knowing what it's like and what worked and what didn't work, I think has been an advantage for me, because you don't want to build for today. You want to build for what you want to be in the future. Right. And in some ways being on that side has helped in that regard. Now, could you argue you stay a year too long? Well, you and I could go back and forth, I'm sure, about both of our careers where, boy, I should have got out of there earlier. I should have stayed a little longer, but it's hard to Monday morning quarterback that stuff. Right?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because when I met you, we had just sold Amentra to Red Hat. And obviously, IBM recently completed the biggest acquisition in tech history, buying Red Hat for north of $35 billion. Do you have any commentary on that, or what did you think when you read that headline?
We sort of pseudo competed with them when I was there, right? Their JBoss kind of suite. At the time, it was really actually though, Java versus Microsoft, right? That was the battle of the late 80s or late 90s, early 2000s, and so we cooperated with them in many ways. Look, I think. Anytime you're as big as IBM and you've had some of the top line challenges, you've got to go make a big bet. And honestly, some of these companies have gotten so big that you got to make a really big bet, right? If you look at somebody was saying this more recently, in a given trading day, Amazon either gains or loses a Boeing. Like that's how big it is, right? Like from a market cap perspective, which is astonishing. And so I think they were in a position where they had to make a bet. I think what Jim Whitehurst did with Red Hat was super impressive. He is a real deal operator, a great customer guy, and has been great for Raleigh too. He's been very active here and
a great guy. I met him 5 or 6 times throughout the process. And
great shooter, right? Just rock star.
And to this day, when I see him, he's like, "Hey, John, how's it going?"
No, I mean, that's why those people are those people, and I'm not, right? Like, remember everything about those things, and it goes a long way. So yeah, I think it's a good move. Look, I think it's a tough space. I think it can be done. I just finished Satya Nadel's autobiography, and look, Microsoft missed mobile.
Yep.
And they
social search,
right? Yeah, exactly. But boy, what a unbelievable transformation. I'd say IBM missed the front half of cloud, right? We had so much revenue, and I'm speaking, not as an IBM representative here, but had so much baked into data centers and hardware and software and all those things that we had those conversations, but it was much easier for an Amazon to just say, "Oh, this is new. We got nothing to lose. Let's go." Yeah. And then IBM's playing catch up a little bit, right?
Yeah. Well, and really what they bought was OpenShift, which is interesting when you think about what OpenShift is, because I was at Red Hat Summit when they announced that they were shifting gears to containers instead of VMs, and they decided to incorporate Kubernetes. And I remember thinking, that's the stupidest name I've ever heard. What the hell is Kubernetes?
I still can't spell it. We use Kubernetes. I still can't spell it. Right.
But kudos to Red Hat, because I mean, look,
Totally.
Red Hat had a lot of value in the JBoss product stack, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Enterprise Virtualization.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, this was about
Yeah, they didn't have
Kubernetes.
$34 billion worth of
No,
value. Those are good,
no.
fine companies, but no, you're 100% right. They made the right technology bet and
Mhm.
they excelled at it. And then that unique business model they have, right?
Yeah.
And no, it's a one of a kind. I know it's cliche to say, but I really do look at that company, that culture, and that'll be the part that'll be interesting. You know, do they truly let it be arm's length and let them maintain their culture? I haven't seen anything that's told me a bunch of people have left or anything, but I'm sure that's a balance.
And,
And
but from everything I've heard, Jim is legitimately the number
totally,
2 guy in the
totally.
company, which that's a big. I
I
think
mean,
that's a big deal.
that's how you prevent the talent drain, right? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, but no, I wish them nothing but the best. Love my time there. And look, they're a stalwart, right, in the technology space. I think we're better to have a strong IBM than not as a world. And so, you know, I wish them nothing but the best.
So you mentioned some things about IBM, and I think you're right. I think a lot of people get a lot wrong with IBM. Although I will say there are a lot of really amazing, smart people at IBM. But time and again, as you mentioned, they miss certain trends. They can't always get out of their own way.
Yeah.
Do you think it's just that operating at that scale, it's impossible to catch every trend, or?
Super great question. I think I would say there is so much. I mean, they I forget what it is, but thousands of patents every year. They're the company that generates the most patents, and commercializing them may or may not result in what you would expect, right? So it's a great question. Honestly, I'd have a bigger job if I knew the answer to it in
Yeah.
terms of kind of dissecting it. I think some of it is the scale. I think some of it is just classic innovator's dilemma. You've got a revenue stream and you're trying to keep that revenue stream, but but you want to introduce new stuff, but you don't want to disrupt. And I mean, we've seen this 1,000 times. But
It's
who knows?
hard. Even
I agree with
even
you. There's more in their laboratories than I think anybody even realizes.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know how much you know about F5 or if you've ever
I
encountered
don't.
those guys in the wild, and they're much smaller scale than IBM, but a big publicly traded company. And they
Yeah.
recently acquired NGINX. And I know it's a struggle because you've got this $2, $3, $4 billion a year business where
Yep.
people like buying hardware and they like
Yep.
putting it in their data center, and you're really good at doing that. But you can see the secular trend is public and hybrid cloud. The secular trend is software defined networks. And
Yep.
so kudos to them for coming in and buying NGINX. But God, I can only imagine if I'm a sales manager and I'm
Yeah.
looking at $12 million deal with not airline's probably a bad example, but
No, I get it. Yeah, airline that you will not be looking for that deal, but yeah.
but I'm looking at a big deal
Hospital
with,
system.
yeah, with
Yeah.
a hospital system
Yeah.
or whatever it is. And the temptation is, well, we can sell this today, but what happens if I don't include this $200,000 NGINX line
Right.
item and they
Right.
do go software defined? They're going to buy from Amazon because Amazon has a solution. Whereas if I have NGINX and I can have the discipline to sell it, even though it may cannibalize.
Sure.
So I think it's a tough thing that everybody deals with.
But and it's also you're a one-off rep. There's
Yeah.
50 lines of management, and bonuses are structured in certain ways. And then I actually think, and I'm not the only one who have said this, I think it's really hard to make a transformation like that if you're a publicly traded company. I think, to me,
Mhm.
some have been able to do it. Google's been able to do it. Amazon's been able to do it. But from their beginning, their message to the street was like, look, we're going to,
Yeah.
Bezos is very clear about what he's going to, he just wrote a letter and said yeah, we're not going to do that profit thing anymore for a while. Right. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think IBM can do that. Right. They got to pay dividends. They got to and so, their cost of capital versus what the expectations are of the street. I mean, it's why you see companies like Dell going private and trying to figure out what the next thing is and then go back public, because in the market we live in with, kind of day-to-day fluctuations and certainly quarterly earnings, it's really hard to maintain your job as a C-level executive and move the ship that dramatically. Right.
Yep. So, and you kind of hit on this. So you had a great career going at IBM. Obviously, you've made the transition from
Arguably.
engineering to selling, and you visited 27 countries along the
Yeah.
way. But you decided to go get an MBA.
Yeah.
What can you walk through just the thought
I mean,
process at that
it was
point?
super simple, right? I felt like a fraud, maybe would be the best way to describe it, in the sense of, I was never I was never an Igor engineer, right?
Mhm.
But I was a good engineer, and I had the foundational elements of how to build software and how things compile and all the stuff you learn as a I was a computer engineer, so a little bit of chip design, a little bit of comp sci. And I had started again, and you experienced this, right? A lot of the folks that we went to school with were using the MBA experience as a transition. Like I'm in this engineering world, many of them, and I want to get to this business world. For you and for me and for others, it was more of an accelerant, right? To go figure out some of this stuff. And I just felt like, how will you ever do anything novel or innovative or disruptive if you don't have the basic building blocks of the way all this stuff works? And so super lucky. I mean, I would have had a hard time doing it if Duke wasn't here, right? I have a family. There's a bunch of reasons why it's really hard to potentially do it at that point. But I loved that experience. I still spent a lot of time over at Fuqua and had been very close with some professors. It's funny, as you get older, then you kind of run into professors in like normal life that are, like at a startup thing or whatever. And so it's been great. And we feel lucky to live here and I'm far away from Penn State, which is where I did my undergrad. So we get back once a year, but I'm over at Duke probably once a month, which is a really fun. And we try to recruit. We just hired some folks from there. We try to recruit from there. So it was a great experience. And it helped me kind of just get up to speed in some regard.
Yeah, because it's interesting. Again, good career at IBM. You probably could have put in another 10 years and found yourself in a good place. But you clearly have transformed from. You're not a lifer at IBM. You've gone into what I think is a very entrepreneurial,
My
journey.
wife would agree with that observation.
So I would like to walk through kind of that transition from IBM, Duke, to where you are now. Was the first step.
First of all, I met you, and then you kept asking me, why do you work for IBM? You should go work somewhere else. Like, what are you doing? So that started it. Honestly, I went back after Duke. I mean, you know this, right? I went back and I was at IBM and got a promotion and was again in a job that I was probably too junior or too inexperienced to have. And honestly, the reality was I got a call initially from a guy named Scott Case. Scott was one of the co-founders of Priceline. I had known Scott through a friend and some philanthropic stuff. We had met and went to a White Sox game once, and we had not gotten to know each other. He was the founding kind of CTO at Priceline, so we had that like tech piece together. And he said, I'm doing this thing with Steve Case. They're not related, but they just happen to have the same last name, Steve, the AOL founder. So he said, come up to DC like 2 days later. So I drove up to DC, and they were just starting something called Startup America, or what became known as Startup America, with the Obama administration, focused on kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem development. So all the great stuff that's happening down in Charlotte and Raleigh. While that was already organically happening, we tried to shine some heat and light into it and gave some guidance on some we were the private side of this, so we didn't really do policy stuff, but this is where crowdfunding legislation came from, and the on-ramp to IPO and some of the other stuff that was in that Jobs Act back in 2012, I think 2013. And so, I went up, it was like, I met with Scott, I met with Steve, I met with a couple other people. They told me the people that were on the board, there was like Reid Hoffman and Reed Hastings and Michael Dell and Tory Burch. And I was like, how do I not do this? Right? Like, how bad could it, even if it implodes, like, I feel like there's enough people here that will be helpful if we all fall down. Right. And so I just kind of dove in, actually, as I left and I kind of resigned from IBM, they were super supportive of it because there was like a red, white, and blue economic development piece to this. They did a lot to kind of make it even easier. And frankly, I had a soft landing if I ever wanted to go back to IBM. So I quit not knowing that. It was super beneficial to have it. And honestly, once I got there, I realized maybe two things. One, I don't want to, I don't want to be a lobbyist. I don't want to work in DC. I don't necessarily, I would very unlikely want to ever run for public office. And that's continued to become more apparent to me over the years. But I did fall in love with startups and also social change stuff where you can work on things that make an impact. And so I look at Scott and Steve, who both I would consider friends and mentors to this day.
Kudos to the Obama administration to reach out to entrepreneurs like Scott and Steve and to say,
they were super, honestly, that was one of the things that, regardless of your political leanings, they were really, really good at public-private partnerships. Like it started sort of the Bush administration. They started doing some of that, but they were all in. They knew what they didn't know. And even if you look at the healthcare.gov stuff, they should have done it earlier, but they went to Google, right? They're like, hey, we need help building this website. Like, let's go to the people that like built the internet. Right. And we were super lucky to have that opportunity. And again, you got to, instead of traveling a bunch of countries, you got to travel to a bunch of cities across the country that I embarrassingly had never been to. And the thing you realize very quickly is that even though 75% of venture capital goes to California, New York, and Massachusetts, right? Just 3 states, and the rest of us are the other 47 are left to fend for to fight off for 25%. The distribution of ideas and creativity and passion is not just to those 3 states, right? 75% of the good ideas don't live in those 3 states. And so it's something I've been really passionate about. And I know you have been a big, dedicate a lot of your time in Charlotte. I try to do what I can here in Raleigh as well. And I'm a big believer. These cities are here because some entrepreneur saw something here X number of years ago, right?
Bank of America was a startup at some point. Family Dollar was a startup. Harris Teeter was a startup.
Somebody was in a trailblazing in a wagon, and they go, oh, there's oil in the ground, or there's fish in the river. Let's build a business. And in some ways, that's the story of America. And I think it was important at that point in time for us to kind of get back to that. And I think it's going to be again important for us to get back to it. Businesses will be destructed, but through COVID. But we've always kind of put on our boots and thought of the next, not just company, but in many cases, the next industry, next whole wave, right? Whether that was, Carnegie and the steel industry all the way through the digital world, right? I think there's opportunities, even though we got to navigate these really choppy waters right now.
So can you maybe speak to some, I'm assuming that there were some important things you learned that were relevant to the journey to where you get to today. You were working with and for some real household names that you just talked about in terms of people who have literally built industries, not just companies. That's great. But I also suspect you were exposed to the good, the bad, and the ugly of startups across all of these geographies and industries. What role did this play in your education process, would you say?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was less structured than IBM, right? So you observe some things, and like anything else, there's people that do it really well. There's people that don't. Like, for me, the thing that stood out, I remember the first time I was in a meeting with a lot of the folks on our board, and maybe not disclosing too much, but I think Reid Hoffman was on one side. Kevin Plank, who I loved, was just a passionate leader, Under Armour founder, was there, and a few of the other folks that I mentioned before. And honest to God, like, that old saying of like, you don't ever want to be the smartest guy in the room, like, or if you are, find a new room. Like, I was the dumbest. Clearly, like, you just looked around like, okay, I get it now why you are who you are, right?
That's the best feeling in the world when you're like, I am literally the dumbest person in
literally
here.
Like, I feel like if they find out how dumb I am, they will ask me to leave the room as to not bring down the IQ of the room. But
and still, I bet that not one of them would have had a 4.0 at Fuqua.
I don't know about that. Yeah, who knows? They would have started 3 companies instead of studying, probably. But so I found one, really smart, no limit to the possibilities, like the classic Steve Jobs, like the moment you realize that men and women created all of this, the stoplight, the stop sign, you start to think about the world in a different way, and you can do some of these things that I think folks limit themselves on. And then I also found, like, really empowering and this isn't the case in every city, the willingness to give feedback, and tough feedback that wasn't personal, but saved you a lot of time, right? I think there are some ecosystems where you go to a pitch and everyone's, oh, way to go, right? And okay, like, we should be supportive. We shouldn't boo people off stage. But I don't think we're helping entrepreneurs by not being straightforward about the reality of, like, where their idea is at. And you can do it in a very tactful way. But I found with that group, even with each other, they were not willing to just kind of let a comment go and then let's not drill into it. Oh, no, let's drill into it and make sure we're doing the right things. So I just learned a lot of that. And then I mentioned earlier, the whole notion of you're going to work on something, there's only so many hours in the day and days of the week. You might as well work on something big that can have a big impact. So that was something that maybe was obvious, or hiding in plain sight in some regards, but those guys really lived and were not bashful about, like, let's go try to make change. Even if we don't try, at least we're in the arena making a difference. And so it was a long list of things, but it really did define me. And I feel super fortunate to have those people sort of in my life, as well as just having some of those experiences.
So at some point, I believe you were involved in starting Main Street Genome. Is that correct?
That's
and
right.
So what was that all about? And how
that
did
was
that
sort of
come
after
about?
Startup America. The kind of the thesis we had was, and this is absolutely accurate, Didn't play out exactly as we thought. But the thesis we had is that there is a huge data divide and access to data, like think business intelligence and analytics for small business versus big business. And so often I think a lot of pricing differences, think of like cost of goods and other things that we view. We often just chalk that up by default to economies of scale. Outback, to use restaurants, Outback Steakhouse gets better pricing on meat because they're Outback Steakhouse, and there's a bazillion Outback Steakhouses, and the mom and pop steak shop doesn't because they're small. That is some ways describes some of the difference, but a big part of the difference is just sophistication of access to data and transparency, right?
Oh, and I can't echo this more. I mean, why Walmart is a world beater has much. I mean, their distribution is impeccable. They do get economies of scale. Their vendor management is great, but Walmart can see trends. I mean, basically, modern data warehousing was invented by retailers, big retailers who said, you know what, we got all this data. This is an asset.
What do we do with it?
Yeah,
that's right. Exactly. That's right. And so our view, and it's still, again, I still think this is the case, that divide is getting wider, right? Because these data sets build on each other, and it just it's almost a foregone conclusion. And so our approach was to take the data sources that Main Street businesses have and build out a model to help them run their businesses more effectively. And in many ways, so we only raised a seed round. We eventually sold the company. It wasn't the outcome that we wanted, but we sold it, and it was fine. But
was that with Scott Case?
It was Scott.
Yeah, correctly. Right. Okay.
And a few others. And one of the things I learned, you learn something in all of these. Distribution was just a bear. Small business distribution is an absolute bear. And then the other one that you learn is, just because you can give folks insight doesn't mean they're going to actually change their behavior, right? Like change is the hard part. The insights is almost the easy part. And that's not just small businesses. That's people, right? Generally, of all ages. But yeah, so we started that company. I won't remember the years, but like 2013, we sold it in 2015. And then I was already sort of in the process. We had kind of raised around. I was thinking about getting back to North Carolina. All that was in DC. And so the opportunity with Scott Moody, seemingly I work with people named Scott or Steve, was the timing was good, which was serendipitous.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a story. What mistakes have you made along the way that you would correct if you had, or that you could correct if you had known what you know now?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, I would have gotten into kind of startup companies earlier. I grew up in central Pennsylvania, had a great childhood, sports, all the stuff you'd want, riding bikes around. Went to a good school. Had enough of a purview into that. This whole computer thing seemed like it was going to stick around for a while, and so I got some of that stuff right. But like, I didn't even know startups existed. Like I know, like I don't know. I just assumed the companies were always there, and to your point, no, we didn't talk a lot about it. So the mental place that I was in, and some of this is just exposure, your family, what businesses they're in. I just didn't even know that the thought of moving to Silicon Valley after undergrad, I wouldn't known which direction to go, let alone that it was a good idea. And I do think there are benefits when you don't have a certain lifestyle and a certain family members and kids and all that stuff. Startups are for anybody, but there are some competitive advantages if you go out and say, hey, I could eat ramen noodles for a while. Maybe I wouldn't have started a company, but I would have joined an early stage company. So that's something I always regret. And as I talk to people, I encourage them, because at that stage in your life, you only got to take care of yourself. And, in many cases, what are you going to go burn a year or two of your life? You're going to get a great network. You're going to probably get experiences that you wouldn't have had otherwise in a fast pace. So that was one thing I would say I regret. And then the other one I always go back is, 9 times out of 10, probably more than that, the first decision I make is the right decision, but I take longer than I need to, right? And I think many people are that way.
I wasn't. For the record, I did not end with a 4.0, but I finished my exam before you every time before everybody, because I didn't have any regrets.
I always thought you had some sort of secret sauce too. I was like, why is this guy finishing so much faster? Like, am I doing this wrong? But
because I don't second guess. I just believe if I think this is the right answer, I'm going with it. And
I double check my own kids' homework. That's my level of obsession with it. But no, I would say that was a big one. You only get so many laps around the sun, right? And so you don't want to kind of waste any of them. I don't think it's possible to be like perfectly precise on it. Mm-hmm. But from a professional perspective, those would be my 2 big ones probably.
Awesome. No, thank you for that. That's always
Yeah.
really helpful for the listeners to hear about those things, because we all obviously make a lot of mistakes, and the question is, what are the ones that you can fix? Because some level of mistakes is actually healthy, but there are things where if you
It's
knew.
funny. I also think I don't think I can fix it. You just got to be aware that it's sort of part of your DNA, and
Mhm.
you got to adjust
Yeah.
to not allow yourself to lean into those things. But you're right. I think I learned a lot from listening to folks,
Yeah.
their mistakes along the way, which is good.
So what is the number one piece of advice or two that you would give startup founders? And I want to ask about across three dimensions, and I'll say them all at once, and then I'll go through each one individually. So number one, when they're thinking about starting a company. Number two, when they're thinking about raising money. And number three, when they're thinking about calling it quits. So let's start with what advice you give to somebody who's thinking about starting a company.
Yeah, look, I think, and I know this is easier said than done. I think it's one of those things where the idea is always good in your head. So I think too many people get, and again, I'm not unique in saying this, but too many people get caught up like, I'm going to keep this idea a big secret, right? Very rarely is the idea the reason something's successful. It tends to be the execution of the
Yeah,
idea.
Facebook wasn't a better idea than MySpace, right?
Like 5 years later, right? Yeah, exactly. And so I think people that hold it in, that's a huge mistake. You're going to waste time. Go validate it with people. If you're embarrassed to tell somebody your idea, like, you're not going to go start that company, because you're going to have to go tell everybody about it. And half, if not more, are going to think you're crazy, right? And think it's a terrible idea and whatnot.
And to your earlier point, even if you're F. Scott Moody, who made a lot of people a lot of money, just
You
because you
gotta
have
go.
the
You
next
go right
idea,
back down the
doesn't, you're
bottom of the
still
hill,
going to hear
and
a lot of
yeah,
no.
yeah, exactly. You just get a lot of no's, right? And by the way, I keep going back. We were talking about seniors in technology at that time. That was definitely a counterintuitive, blend, right?
Mhm.
For most traditional VCs. So that's what I would say. Like, get out, socialize it, and it'll become very quick. And if you're gonna do it, do it. Like, I've not seen a ton of, like, side hustle stuff is good, but I have not seen a ton of like breakout successful companies that were side hustle, right? There are
Yep.
some, but I think you need to kind of get in the game. The other one I would also say, and this is as an aside there, having some domain experience in the industry, I think, is very important. I think we sensationalize the dorm room founder, and there are Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, but and even Airbnb, similar, was sort of they were struggling with this, or the Slack story. Like, sometimes it's that, but I think more often than not, this stuff is actually, I understood a market, I saw a seam in the technology or a seam in the market that somebody else didn't see, and I fill it. I
Yep.
don't know. You probably have seen the same thing, yeah.
I love domain expertise. It was really, once we figured that out at Level, we were off to the races. Like,
Yep.
hey, we have this horizontal capability that is
Yep.
Java development and Kubernetes configuration and public cloud and all of this.
Yep.
And that's all useful. But once we were able to start hiring domain expertise, and I
Same.
was fortunate to have a co-founder who is one of the strongest technology minds in banking that I've ever met. So he already
Right.
had domain expertise, but more that we never regretted hiring someone from industry who
Yeah.
really could make that
That's
jump, you know?
that's right. And I think you see that, and maybe you want a co-founder that maybe is one or the other, right? You
Mhm.
can look at those mixes. On raising money, I would say, again, one, you're getting married for a long time, so don't think of this as a transaction. Think of this as a
Mhm.
relationship. It's been said, and again, I think it's easy to say if you've got capital of your own to spend on it, or you don't have lifestyle commitments of, try to bootstrap. And I do think if you can do it yourself, like,
Revenue is the best source of funding
for
ever.
sure, non-dilutive capital. And by the way, like, if you own 100% of your company, you sell it for $10 million, you make $10 million,
Yeah.
right? If you own 1% of $100 million company, you know what I mean? Like, it's all relative in that regard. So when it comes to your ownership stake and the potential wealth generation opportunity, it doesn't all have to be 100 million, 200 million, a billion, $2 billion companies. At the same time, I do think I've done now 2 companies with more institutional venture, and there's a ton they can bring, relationships, and I would vet them. I talk to other founders around it. Everybody will come in and say they're not just about writing a check. They're about, all the other, like, that's, everybody aligns to that. Some it's true, some it's not. Like I said before, we've been very lucky with the folks we have, but you want to be purposeful there and vet them and talk to other people they've invested in. So that's a big piece. And then the wind down one's a tough one, right? Like, there's a part of it, like, 80% of these things fail, maybe more. So, like, sometimes there is a part of you that's like, it, and you're just unwilling to unwind it. And in fact, I would say, in people that I've been around in this regard, if you're straightforward with your investors and your employees and stuff, like people know the percentages. It's not, it's not bad. But at the same time, I also, Scott Moody says as often is like, you only fail if you stop.
Yeah, well, that's
Right.
true.
Yeah. And so I think it's a tough one, and it's
It's a
going to come up
balancing act. Yeah, it's a balancing act, right? Like, and I think part of it depends on your age and like what your socioeconomic status is.
Totally
Have you
does.
had an exit? Like there's different calculations. We have someone here, or a group of guys here in Charlotte that they had multiple successful companies. One had started Jigsaw.
Yeah.
One had built the online sales team for Dell, and then built the online sales team for Web Methods, and then it started 2 companies that he sold to Salesforce. And they built a rock star group of guys. They went out and they raised money because they could have funded it themselves, but they were like, let's raise money. Let's let the town of Charlotte see a startup that comes up, raises money, and goes and tackles a market.
Yeah.
They had what seemed like a good idea. They called it the other screen. And Garth and Chris are 2 of the finest entrepreneurs you'll ever meet, and they cover each other's blind spots. And they decided after raising their money that they weren't going to be able, that they had missed it. They missed the product market fit. And I do wonder, they both did a really good job of talking about the failures that they had to people in very public forums. And so that was awesome. But I always wondered, I was like, is it different when you've had some success to be able to walk away from something?
I think that's right. It's probably easier to pull the ripcord on it. But look,
at the same time, like they've both gone on to be wildly successful in their next thing. So it's like, well, kudos to them. They could have wasted 2 more years and never gotten.
Well, and that's the part, like in the end, look, time is the scarcest asset we have, right? Like I know money is a reality to that, but time is the scarcest in the end. And you're going to spin your wheels on stuff. So that would be one I would probably be very reticent to give advice, period, because it's such a personal decision and depending on what you're building. But I do think one of the things is don't let hubris and don't let, some of these other things get in the way. Like don't not do it because you're going to be embarrassed by it or whatnot. Like I think anybody who's a legitimate entrepreneur who's been in these companies knows that it takes the stars aligning in addition to a good idea and hard work. Right. And there's in some regards to me, a couple people with battle scars is actually, a badge of honor in startups, not a negative.
Yeah. I've had more than 2 bad investments, but I've had 2 investments where it went south and the founders were talking to me and they're beating around the bush. And I'm like, look, nobody's going to blame you for walking away from this. You've given it what you could give it. That's and right. you, at the end of the day, like this shouldn't take your health down, and it will if you stick with it. That's exactly right. But it's tough because you do wonder, like, well, if Steve Jobs had given up on Apple.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, like welcome to probably every entrepreneur's night of sleep, right? Like you're always saying, what if I did this? What if I did that? But I think, and we're lucky. I spent a lot of time, even with Startup America, in some other countries, and there are countries in the world that if you have a company that goes out of business, you can no longer be a C-level executive in that business.
Wow.
Right. And
I've heard that, but that's so
talk about not encouraging risk-taking in entrepreneurship. I mean, literally they still call it risk capital instead of venture capital. Even the name itself gives a sense of what their leanings are in terms of their beliefs on it. And look, I think we got a bunch of challenges in America, but our ability to maintain an entrepreneurial spirit and to not have a negative view on failure and encourage people to try stuff and to have a robust, private equity kind of venture capital market. And I think it's critical because unless we think that innovation is going to stop, we got to keep leaning in. Right. Yep. And hopefully that continues.
Well, no, those are great answers for all 3 of those. Thank you. Is there a book or 2 or 3 that you find yourself recommending very often to people who are thinking about this?
I said to you earlier, I'm not a sales guy, but the Challenger book that the folks at Corporate Executive Board wrote, I'm now a firm believer that everyone's a seller, like whether you're raising money or you're trying to hire somebody or whatnot. So I look at that one a lot. John Doerr's book around
the Challenger book. I'm going to write this down.
It's called the Challenger. I think it's called the Challenger Sales Model. It's literally like one of these sales books, but super, super interesting. The Measure What Matters is a big one for me. The John Doerr's, the OKRs, that kind of the story of Google's OKRs and that approach. And I'm a big fan of that model.
Cool. Very cool. No, that's great. So how involved have you gotten in local entrepreneurial communities, and not necessarily, obviously with Startup America, you met a bunch of them, but I'm saying more like your own personal,
honestly,
like
I would tell
DC and
you,
Raleigh.
I would tell you not as much as I should. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think early on in this company, I did more. I went to more meetups. I try to help out. Like I still mentor for Techstars in a few places. Help some, like when venture capitalists will come from different parts of the country, I try to help kind of curate. I know some people that can help make sure they have good meetings and whatnot. But honestly, you get kind of knee deep in these companies and you go through pandemics and all the other realities of startups, and you do lose track of it. I mean, for me, and you've lived this as well, I do my best to stay in touch with family and friends and the company. That's it, right? There's not a lot of hobbies, right? You get to the gym as much as you can, or like you put a bike in your house, right? Like that's what it comes to, though, right? So I do some stuff at Fuqua. Fuqua has a cool entrepreneurship program, which, by the way, when we get you up, we need to get you in front of some folks there.
Is that with Howie Ree and that?
Yeah, well,
crew?
so Howie's part of that, but David Rubenstein, who's on the board, obviously Carlisle, had given a bunch of money, and they built a thing called the Bullpen in downtown Durham, which I give him a lot of credit. Much like kind of StartX at Stanford, even with all the entrepreneurial activity that happens in Palo Alto, it happens more in Palo Alto than it does on campus. And so it's rare for a university to like build something off campus. So it's right downtown Durham. We'll go next time you're here.
Awesome.
But look, I need to do more. I think we can all do more. You and I talking about it earlier too. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done around increased access to capital for different regions of the country, different minority groups, female founders. Still not enough capital going to female founders, and I think there's a role for us all to play there. And sometimes I feel like it's hard when you're in the midst of a company, but it's important to say yes, to some of those things.
Yeah. And how different is it in your mind participating in these communities as a community organizer, which arguably at Startup America you were, versus as a startup founder?
I mean, I think it's very different. In fact, I would say I'm sort of I subscribe to the Brad Feld kind of view of the world, in the sense of like the best organizers are actually founders, right? People that have founded some companies and maybe did get lucky, have an exit, and want to give back. To me, treating your community as you would treat your startup is sort of the mentality that I've seen work. And it's very rare. It takes government, it takes universities, it takes big companies, it takes a local government, but they shouldn't lead it. It really should be led by the entrepreneurs themselves. And you see Boulder and Austin, that's where that type of stuff has certainly happened. But no, look, it's a lot easier to be like, hey, you should go speak at a lot of these things and do this, that, and the other thing when you got a whole, three other jobs when it comes to running your company. But again, it's one thing Scott Case had always said to me. He tries to default to yes when people ask him to do stuff.
Yes.
And sometimes it's really hard, but sometimes you say yes to certain things and it becomes this magical. There's been things I said yes to and got in the car and felt like, ugh, why did I say yes to this? But on the way home, I was like, I would have never met this person, or I wouldn't have seen this. And it's actually beneficial for you as much as it hopefully is for everybody else.
It's funny you say that, because I've gotten more involved with Duke in the Charlotte community in particular, and I've spoken on a couple of panels. I've moderated a couple of panels. I sat in on a table for 6, and the day of, I'm always like, why the fuck did I agree to do this?
Totally.
And then,
I mean, always. Like, I'm trying to think, can I get out of it? Can I be sick tomorrow? Right. But then I've never once, right?
Yeah, I've never once left one of those events and been like, wow, that was a waste of time.
Totally right. Totally right. And look, I think it was one of the things you and I experienced with Duke generally, and I think you can recreate this. And you can do this with startup ecosystem hubs, co-working spaces. You can do it in a lot of different contexts. But one of the things that was so cool about us going there is you would leave the real world and you would have this breath of fresh air of academia, right? And maybe we didn't always agree with the academic perspective on it because we were dealing with the real world perspective, but it did give you that space to kind of just think differently and to hear other people's perspectives. And too often we get this kind of myopic focus when your head's down trying to build a company. So it's therapeutic in addition to could have some good business or career, aspects to it.
It's interesting you say that. I haven't published it yet, but I've recorded an interview with Chris Elmore, who was the first employee at Avid Exchange. And a couple things that are interesting is he talked a lot about Brad Feld is on their board and was one of their early investors. And
He's something else. He's a good
yeah,
guy.
yeah, absolutely. And the fact that he's coming to Charlotte for these board meetings is awesome for Charlotte because they end
Brad
up
doesn't
snagging
fly.
him.
He very rarely flies, so it is good. Yeah, and you should be lining up a bunch of other meetings for him to take, right?
Yeah. And actually, you're right. I think a lot of these have actually been virtual, even in the pre-COVID days, where he's like,
Well,
he just
he sort of, in some ways, I don't want to speak for him, but like made a lifestyle decision, but no different than
yeah,
what you're talking about before. It didn't take a pandemic for him to say, "Hey,
yeah,
this is just not good for your body." He's a big runner and
yeah.
family, and yeah, it's. So I give him a lot of credit for kind of being willing to just say that, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and the other interesting thing with Chris is that he teaches entrepreneurial classes at Queen's University in
Yeah,
UNC Charlotte, and
yeah,
he talked a lot about I asked him why he teaches, and he's like, it's how I learn. Like I learn a lot more
yeah. Something to be said about that. Yeah, for
teaching. Yeah,
sure.
and there's no doubt that what you're
You now
talking about.
motivate me. I know if your goal of this is motivating me to get more involved, but I'm gonna go get more involved again. Yeah.
I try to. I don't do it enough. I grumble every time
Yeah.
someone pulls me into one of these, but honestly, like we owe it to people. And I've got a very good friend that I've been trying to get more engaged. He's
Yeah.
one of the top entrepreneurs in Charlotte. I'm not going to say his name, but
Yeah.
he's got this incredible success story. It's inspirational. He can look at anything and find an opportunity. He's made himself wildly wealthy doing it.
Yeah.
But he won't talk. Like I said, will you come on my podcast? And he's like, no, I don't.
do it.
I'd feel like I was bragging. And I'm like, you're not bragging. You owe this to the community
Sure.
to inspire others and
Yeah, no,
get them there.
I think, look, I think it's important. I think it's important you take the time to do it. And then I also think even beyond those bigger events, and you and I probably don't do this enough either, but just one-on-one with other entrepreneurs is therapeutic as well. Right. And again, the good entrepreneurs I know are the ones that are willing to pick up the phone and be very transparent. They're not trying to hide, protect their ego. They're like, this is what I'm struggling with, whether it's emotionally or more and more, I think people are talking about like these companies are strained mentally on you, right? It strains relationships. It strains a lot of things. And our ability to talk about it and at least commiserate with one another is a huge value, right?
Absolutely. So along these lines, what do
Yeah.
communities get wrong? Do you think the entrepreneurial community?
Well, I think, I mean, again, one of the biggest things I go back to, and I'm not inventing this. I'm borrowing this from Brad initially, and I think some others that have come to this conclusion is when you try to do it top down, when you try to, government-led, economic development-led, and that's not to say those things aren't important. They very much have a role to play, but it has to be entrepreneurial-led, and I've seen it sort of time and time again. And I'll be honest with you, when I first kind of early started America, I didn't really see it, and then people said it, and Brad wrote a book, Startup Communities. You read it, I'm like, I don't know, but when you do go and see it, it's absolutely the case, and there's got to be a pay it forward mentality. One of the other big things that I think is important, and we don't always see this in the Southeast, but I think structuring your company where as many, if not all, employees have equity share in it is really important, because in the end, if you build a company, you have 100 employees and 2 people get really wealthy on it, it actually doesn't help the ecosystem. Maybe from a marketing perspective it does, but it doesn't generate, not somebody who's just, crazy wealthy, but has enough money that they can go roll the dice again. That's the story of Silicon Valley is.
Well, no, but that's the story of DC too, right? Like
Yes.
It is absolutely the $1 trillion startup. I talk about that a lot, but for me, growing up in DC, it wasn't just Steve Case that got wealthy.
Right.
There were
there was a whole
4 or 5 billionaires
out
and
of
like
that company.
thousands of millionaires. Everybody that I grew up with knew somebody who was a secretary and made $4 million in the AOL.
That's right. That's right. And I tell you, that's not all, like, I don't want to call it the Southeast, but that is not always the case. And by the way, you don't, as a founder, always have to do it, right? Because in some parts of the country, people don't value equity like they, in Silicon Valley, they're saying, how much salary can I give back in order to have more equity? That tends not to be the case in other places because they just haven't learned this delta between income generation and wealth creation. And even for me, I didn't really have enough of a sense of it until I was presented with it. But I think as founders, as people, as part of these ecosystems, that's one of the biggest things we can do is if you inspire and hopefully give some fuel to the next generation. And it doesn't always have to be a direct investment. It could be just helping to build a successful company and they had a share in that stake. I think that's one of the ways you build this family tree. Almost all these, Boulder, Austin, Seattle, has a family tree that goes back to some founder
Yep.
right? That then just it spreads from there, or one company, right? A set of people. Red Hat's a big one here, right? That you've
Yep.
gotten a bunch of companies that just kind of spread out of that.
Absolutely. And maybe SaaS is that same
Yeah, it's
kind of
probably right.
multiplier in
Although they
reality.
never went public, so you never
Yeah.
saw that huge kind of
True.
liquidity event, right? But yes, you obviously get crazy data talent from there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's funny that I talk about this a lot, actually, that exact thing. Like, and I use AOL as the example, like
It's important.
without,
No, you lived it, right? Like that
yeah,
was
like
that
you
area,
don't
right?
have Revolution Capital without AOL. And now, ironically, Revolution isn't just investing in DC, they're actually investing Rise of the Rest.
Yeah,
And
exactly. All different ecosystems. That's right. Yeah. Full
yeah,
disclosure, they are an investor in K4Connect. So
awesome.
I don't know if you need disclosures, but yeah.
No, they also invested in Igor's company,
Absolutely.
Prion, as
Yeah,
well.
absolutely.
That was one of my proudest moments. Steve Case retweeted a tweet because Igor had promoted Prion had promoted our podcast interview,
Yeah.
and then
Awesome.
when I saw Steve Case retweet it, I was like, oh, that's
That's like, if
cool.
you're looking for followers in the startup world, that's a good way to get them. That's for sure. Yeah.
So you touched on it a little bit. What do you think is the best thing a local government can do to accelerate entrepreneurial
Yeah,
activity? And
it's
I
funny.
wouldn't ask this of most
Yeah.
founders, but through your work with Startup America, you probably have a
Look,
perspective.
I mean, honestly, I wish I was smarter on some of the government entities. There's the easy kind of macro stuff, which I do think, if you look at the data, the flow of venture capital, there's just challenges there. I think there are things we can do to make it more attractive to invest. I think Steve's doing it. I don't speak for him, but I think he's doing it because it's the right thing to do. I also think he thinks there's really good companies that can be very successful. Right? It's not just a philanthropic thing. It's a combination. I do think it's been good to see a lot of the co-working spaces and that sort of stuff. I'm not sure that it's one ingredient. I think people look at it as like the ingredient. I don't think it ultimately is. I think there's a lot we can do around student debt relief or temporary relief on it. I think there's still some capital gain stuff that maybe isn't perfectly there. I'd like to see some changes around the structure of options. I think early stage, it can be cost prohibitive to even exercise your options. There's a lot of people that leave options on the table when they move on because they don't have $100,000 to pay the taxes on the options that may or may not ever become liquid, right? Which is the reality of it. And then, the one thing people miss is how expensive it has become to go public, from a Sarbanes-Oxley and a regulatory perspective. And I know those things were important, but people miss that something like 80% of the job creation in the companies went public in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was after IPO, after that large cash infusion. And, when we were doing Startup America, there were whole quarters where nobody went public. Right. And you see now a lot of companies staying private, and they're doing it because there's private money to be had and you don't have to have all the regulation, but you do miss that accelerant. So I look, there's a long list. There's people way smarter than me at this. But look, I think for North Carolina, which you and I are biased towards, I think we got to continue to, I think
how about let's never ever pass a bathroom bill?
I mean,
again?
that's exactly
we can start
right.
with that.
Right. I mean, I had to talk, I literally had to answer questions on that as if I had some realm of thought that was ever going to happen for multiple years.
Let's quit disenfranchising minority voters. That might help a little bit.
Exactly. So
not to get political, but it feels like our state is successful in spite of its government policies.
And look, I think there's all these things are hard, and you're right. There's people smarter than us to be able to get political about it. But my big thing is where my politics will be on this topic is we need to be pro-entrepreneur. I think it's crazy not to be pro-entrepreneur. I think it is the reason why every company is here. And yes, we happen to live in a world or an economy where it's sort of creative destruction, right? So jobs do get destroyed along the way, but we also historically have leaned in and created new jobs. There are jobs like social media manager that would not have been a job right before. And there's many, many, many other examples of that. And so for me, the thing that would be really bad is to stop leaning in. The jobs are still going to get disrupted. They're just going to get disrupted by other countries and companies that are formed there. And then you stop being that kind of leading innovation. And so for me, I'm less concerned about, and I think there are things in my personal life that obviously I get involved in, but when it comes to startups, I think encouraging people to be able to start companies, I think student debt's a big downward pull, and we got to figure that out. It'll be interesting to see how higher education navigates COVID. I think it's going to be a little bit of a wake up call to some of the I don't know, thousands of percent increase probably in tuition since I went to school. And yet I presume you go into a classroom. It's not, when we went to Duke, it wasn't that much different than our undergrad experience. There
No.
was a laptop that was like the equivalent of the difference. Right. And so I do think we have to make this place a great, diverse place to start and scale companies. I still think there's a sense that there are certain places you have to go in order to scale. And I just don't believe that. I think you can find great talent here. I think there's almost an arbitrage opportunity when
Well,
it comes
it's interesting because we always, like in Charlotte, we talk a lot about an energy corridor or an energy hub because Duke Energy is the biggest by many measures. Or we think about financial services because three gigantic banks in Charlotte.
Yeah.
But I interviewed a gentleman, young entrepreneur who moved his company from Seattle to Charlotte. And his company is called New Fabrics, and he had really bad acne when he was in undergrad at the University of Washington. And he said, what if I formulated a pillowcase that could dispense acne medicine? Because I don't like taking acne medicine, but if it were just here. And so that's what he did. He created fabrics where he could infuse topically applied things.
That's crazy.
Supplements. And he was building a great business. And he decided to move to Charlotte, and in particular in Conover, North Carolina, there's an accelerator. I forget what it's called, but they have an accelerator where they literally introduce you to all the different textile companies and service providers in the North Carolina region. And nobody thinks about textiles, but in reality, we are much better suited to have a textile cluster than we are financial or biomedical or anything else, really. And he moved here because of that. And then his theory got tested when he ended up creating or figuring out that he could infuse antimicrobial copper into fabric. And then he started creating N95 masks. And with antimicrobial copper. And so CDC picked it up. Fox News picked him up and put him on Fox News. Wow. He literally had done $1 million of revenue in 1 week, like 3 weeks before I talked to him. And he was like, John, there is nowhere else literally in the world that I could scale a business this quickly. Sure. And he was like, I was able to make a call and walk like across the street. And like, it was pretty cool.
I think, it's interesting. If you go back at like the .com space or that time period, I think there were, even afterwards, there were a lot of cities trying to become the next Silicon Valley. Like, I think that is a fake goal, right? When it comes to consumer tech and just some of the stuff that the Valley is really, really good at. We should all want the connectivity and the entrepreneurial ecosystem and ideally access to capital and those sorts of things and support for failure and all those sorts of things. We should have those everywhere. But I believe every city, you look at Pittsburgh's a great example. My wife's from Pittsburgh, is a steel city, and they should be fantastic now at this next turn of the crank around robotics. And then with University of Pittsburgh Medical and UPMC, they got a great health tech stuff. Like, we should not try to be somebody we're not. There will always be exceptions. There's some kid or that will create something, a consumer tech app. Sure, that can happen anywhere, but we should be really good at the core domain stuff, almost the domain stuff we were talking about earlier, because you've got talent from that domain. You've got connections in that domain. You've got capital that understands that domain. And I agree with you. 30 cents of every dollar that's spent in healthcare in the United States goes through the state of Tennessee. Well, guess what kind of startups there should be in the state of Tennessee? And you see it in Nashville and whatnot. So I totally agree with you. I think we need to, like anything else, you got to see what assets you have, and you either ignore those assets or you play those assets, right?
Well, and I talk about this a lot on this podcast, just because I'm friends with the guys leading the charge at Passport. Are you familiar with Passport? Or okay,
not intimately, but aware.
Yeah. So Passport had built a solution. Very good solution. Back then they were called Passport Parking, and all they did was parking. They've since grown into something completely, but they went and responded to an RFP at Charlotte and didn't even make the fucking short list. And they had, and I remember the answer that whoever was the spokesperson for Charlotte at the time said, we don't think it's a scalable solution for a city the size of Charlotte. It must have been 3 or 4 weeks later, Chicago awards them a sole source contract to do the parking. And it's like, really, Chicago?
Well, I'm remiss I didn't bring it up because you just reminded me of it. You asked earlier, what can local
Yeah.
governments do? What
Buy
can
our
local
products. Buy
Yeah,
our
no, but
products.
that's right. What can local big companies do? If
Yeah.
you look at the procurement requirements for big companies that they have on their vendors or the government
Mhm.
at all levels, it'll say, hey, give me 10 years of audited financials. And it's like, I'm a 10-month-old company. Sorry. But
Yeah.
you think about the innovation that can be had and the cost savings and the value and to go full circle back to the COVID stuff we were talking about earlier. You want to talk about, financial challenges. Local and state level governments are going to be, I
Mhm.
mean, they may hopefully not bankrupt, but like close to it. We got to figure out ways to make government smarter. And to me, the way to do that more often than not is to partner with startups and to be open with startups in some cases about where the opportunity is. Like, hey, we're trying to
Yeah.
figure out parking. Imagine it wasn't just that they said no, but they were open. They were at these startup events and they were saying, hey, we, the city of Charlotte, need to figure this out. Partner with folks here. Let's not I think the whole like old school RFP model is so weird to
Yeah.
me, right? It's like by definition, you're going to get something you're not happy with,
Yep.
right? Like let's collaborate here. Let's not throw it over the fence.
Well, I've seen two things along those lines that are promising. One, do you know Manoj Govindan? I
Yeah, yeah,
believe you
yeah,
know him. So
yeah, for sure.
Manoj created a role at Bank of America where he could literally bridge the divide between the investment
I
bank
remember this.
and
Yeah, for
yeah,
sure.
and he would go in and he could get you a
Yeah,
get
he
out
knew
of jail
everybody,
free
right?
card. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Literally, he was like his
yeah,
job was to like get you in front of and get you through procurement because they knew that they had to drive innovation.
yeah,
And then he did the same thing at Wells Fargo. So
yeah.
that's promising to me that big companies see that. But I think I saw something in Atlanta that takes it even one step further, which is Engage VC. Are you
Yeah,
familiar with
yeah,
it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And what they do is they've raised money from a bunch of big corporates and they invest that money in promising technology companies. And then you have to commit not just the capital, but like your people have to come in and figure out how to partner with these startups,
Yep.
and it drives innovation.
That's right.
And
Look, hey,
yeah.
we're seeing it right now, John. I mean, just to do relevant, right? This was we were recording this. It was last weekend that that SpaceX, rocket
Mhm.
and went to the space station with the second demo Crew Dragon. I gotta believe, and I haven't looked at all the financials of it, but I gotta believe the commercial space program they put in place that has Boeing competing with SpaceX, that has got to generate not only better technology but also better financial realities than the old school NASA way,
Yep.
right? And why local governments and state level governments and certainly the federal government wouldn't look at it that way? It makes business sense. It makes financial sense. I know it's different than what they've done in the past, but I think there's huge opportunities, and that also helps develop the startup ecosystems we were talking about before. So I'm with you. That's a good area. The only problem here is we don't have enough time to work on all these different
I know.
these opportunities. You got more time than I do right now as you build out, but and I'm sure you're thinking about a lot of that.
Absolutely. So one last question here,
Yeah.
because I'm cognizant of your time. Are there any technology or business or societal trends that you're thinking about most over, say, a 5 to 15 year time horizon? Or are you so busy and focused
No,
on? Yeah.
look, I think like many, and it's funny, these things kind of depending on what news cycles they kind of come in and out, but I do think I'm super intrigued by, like you mentioned Igor before. I'm super intrigued by this notion of augmented intelligence, right? So
Hmm.
there's the one side which I'm concerned about. It's going to happen, but we got to think about how we navigate it, which is just pure autonomous, right? When you look at truck drivers, the most popular job in 32 states or something like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
in terms of number of employees. We got to think about what the future of work is and how we train folks. And I think folks need to be willing, and I know this is easier said than done, but the job you had when you were 20, it may or may not be the job you have when you're 40, right? Like we got to be willing to almost reinvent ourselves. In some ways, that doesn't actually seem too crazy to me. This is sort of what we talked about it throughout this podcast. Like the change and the opportunity for growth, the reason why you teach is to learn, like all of those things, I think play into what the future is, but it definitely feels like a static kind of job is going to be less viable, longer term. I look at a lot of the Andrew Yang stuff, and honestly, as crazy as it sounds initially around some of the basic income stuff, like he's not wrong that these jobs are going to get destroyed, right? And so hopefully we invent new ones, but it's going to require a lot of change. So it's funny. On one side, I'm concerned about autonomous. I'm excited about it as a Tesla owner, right? But I'm concerned about it as a from a macroeconomic perspective. And then on the other side, you look at things like augmented intelligence, which is kind of using a lot of the same building blocks that can give folks superhuman strength. They can help them make better decisions. It, I think, will disrupt the way we train people and the way we educate people. Those two, I think it's a classic example if you don't know which way it's going to play out. And again, it's a dynamic period of time. So I'm all those, the machine learning, the big data, all the stuff that's behind that is super interesting. The quantum computing, there's so much to be interested in. And at the same time, there's two sides to every one of these coins, right? There's a lot of really interesting positives, and there could be some significant, not negatives, but just disruption, right, to like normal way of life.
Well, and hopefully, we've got two mega trends going on, or not mega, but two things that are grabbing all of our attention right now. We've got a pandemic. We've talked a lot about that. We've also got a lot of social unrest that's uncovering a lot of social injustice. And you just hope that with the opportunity to reinvent industry, maybe we can kill two birds with one stone.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. Look, there's a lot of people hurting right now. And I think, look, humans generally, like, we got to go up to the next thing. Right. And I think there is some encouraging things that we could look at. And I think we got to do it in an inclusive way, and we've got to do it in a holistic way. But even with all the challenges, there's opportunity to continue to evolve and hopefully make sure everybody's involved in that future. But it's crazy times, and sometimes I feel it's a good distraction to talk about tech and business when you have a lot of those things going on, but you're also cognizant of them, right, along the way.
Yeah. It's hard to divorce the two, and you really can't avoid thinking about it, because
shouldn't, right?
Whether it impacts you directly or not, I think we can all see
impacts
the video of George Floyd, and we can say, Jesus Christ, there was a human standing on another human's neck for 8.5 minutes, and 3 guys watched, and you can't ignore that. Like, you can't escape that. But it is nice to temporarily stop thinking about it, because it's a tough problem.
We got a long way to go. I think we all have a role to play in improving and again, I not to be to bring it all the way back to this, but I actually think economic opportunities, startups, innovation, more inclusion in that space can be a big part. Not the whole solution. There's a bunch of other systemic things that need to be worked on. But I think it's one area that at least I know a lot about, a lot about, we can actually get involved in and do. And we've been lucky. We've got a very diverse set of startups and founders and founding teams here in Raleigh-Durham, especially in Durham. Downtown Durham's been historically has had a really diverse founder and startup network, and it's only gone further. And again, we got to do what we can to be helpful and do the right thing.
Well, and as technologists, I think, look, Facebook, Twitter, they've got their problems, they've got their issues. There's privacy, there's all sorts of questions around it. But I think we can all admit that we couldn't surface the problem that's being surfaced right now, and couldn't address it without smartphones and without ubiquitous social networks. So kudos to the tech community for shining a light on that.
They shined a light on it. They created some other chaos, and so we got to go sort it all out. But yeah, no, I'm with you. Like the fact that all of this was there.
Mm-hmm.
We now are exposed to it, which I think is beneficial in the sense of we can start to address it in a more meaningful way. So, as I'm sure for you, thinking a lot, thoughts and prayers for those folks. And we spent a lot of time thinking about frontline work. I mean, it's hard we got chaos on top of chaos in terms of problems right now. But make sure we do what we can to be helpful.
Absolutely. So I have to ask,
yes.
Penn State for undergrad, you have a great football tradition.
Yeah.
Duke for grad school, obviously a rich basketball history. If you get your PhD, where do you go? Baseball, hockey?
I don't follow any other sports, so I'm good. That's a reason not to get a PhD. Look, best of both worlds. I actually, real story. I grew up a Duke fan. So my uncle, who was married in the family, played at Duke in the late 60s and early 70s. So I was like the one kid during like Fab Five, and Jordan had just kind of gotten big. And so everybody was wearing like Carolina stuff and Michigan stuff in Pennsylvania. I was the one kid with a Bobby Hurley jersey and a Duke jacket. So that came total full circle for me. And I'd always been a Duke fan.
So I watched Grant Hill. He played at the rival high school to my high school. And so like, for me, I didn't hate Duke. I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. Grant Hill went there.
Super cool. Yeah. So I'm happy where I'm at, man. I got the best of both worlds. And here's hoping we get a chance to see at least even maybe fanless sports. The Last Dance was my last, so good. Kind of savior, right, from a sports perspective.
Yeah, so good. I did not want that to be over. It's funny
because
I watched another 10 knew a lot. I knew a lot of the history, but like seeing it all laid out, that was
you and I are similar age. That was like very influential period of your life, and I remember waiting in line to get the new Jordans and all. It was cool to see the backside of it and share it, as I'm sure you did. I'd share it with my kids as well. Yeah,
exactly.
We watched the version where they took the curse words out, but we still watched it.
Well, look, Derek, it has been fascinating, and I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to share your story with my audience.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this. Like you said, I feel like the unqualified person out of all the other people you've interviewed, but I find these things to be super. I think it's just good. If you take one or two things away, it's good for it's what time well spent, right?
Awesome. Well, congratulations on all the success and onward and upward as always.
Stay safe, my friend. Cheers.
All right. Cheers.